Did you see that?
Deep within remote forests and mist-covered ridges, strange events unsettle even seasoned travelers. Objects are rearranged with eerie precision, guttural growls echo through the trees, and massive footprints appear after sudden vanishings. From a mangled RV in the wilds of Washington's Olympic rainforest to a jolted train deep in the fog-shrouded mountains of eastern Tennessee, these encounters reveal disturbing signs of something powerful and intelligent at work. In this video, we'll uncover 6 haunting encounters that remain unexplained. The morning mist clung to the dense forest canopy of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state as Ranger Cole Brenham began his routine patrol on September 10, 2025. This remote section of temperate rainforest, located approximately 40 miles southwest of Port Angeles, had served as a popular camping destination for decades. The area was known for its towering Douglas firs, some over 200 feet tall, and its network of unmarked trails that wound through valleys carved by ancient glacial movement. Local indigenous tribes had long considered these woods sacred, warning of spirits that roamed the deeper groves, though most visitors dismissed such stories as folklore. Cole had been patrolling these woods for nearly 8 years, and he had never encountered anything more threatening than the occasional black bear or aggressive elk during mating season. The morning started like any other, with him checking the designated camping areas and ensuring no illegal fires had been left smoldering. However, as he approached clearing number 7, a secluded spot nestled between 2 ridgelines, something immediately struck him as wrong. A silver recreational vehicle sat at an odd angle, its door hanging open like a broken jaw. Cole parked his Ranger truck and approached cautiously, noting the eerie silence that seemed to blanket the entire clearing. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, and even the usual whisper of wind through the canopy had stilled. The 30-foot RV, which appeared to be only a few years old, showed signs of violent disturbance even from a distance. As Cole drew closer, his trained eye picked up details that made his stomach clench with unease. Deep gouges scarred the metal exterior walls, running in parallel lines that were too wide and too deep to have been made by any bear he knew. The scratches appeared deliberate, almost artistic in their precision, as if something had been testing the strength of the aluminum siding. Small camping chairs lay scattered around a cold fire pit, but they were not randomly thrown about. They had been arranged in a perfect triangle, each chair facing outward toward the tree line. Cole reached for his radio and called in his position before stepping toward the open RV door. The metallic steps leading into the vehicle were bent and twisted, as if something enormously heavy had stepped on them repeatedly. Inside, the scene that greeted him defied immediate comprehension. 3 bodies lay within the narrow confines of the RV's main living area. 2 men and 1 woman, all appearing to be in their 20s or early 30s, were positioned in ways that suggested they had not simply fallen where they died. 1 man lay across the small dining table, his arms stretched out as if embracing the wooden surface, while the second man was curled in the corner near the kitchen area, his body forming an almost perfect circle. The woman lay on her side near the bathroom door, her long brown hair spread out in a fan pattern that seemed too neat to be accidental. Each body bore wounds that Cole's experience could not readily categorize. The injuries appeared to be from massive claws, but the patterns were unlike anything he had seen in his wildlife training. The wounds were deep and precise, suggesting incredible strength, yet there was an odd restraint to them, as if the attacker had been calculating rather than frenzied. A weak moan from the bedroom area caused Cole to spin around, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon. He found a 4th person, a young woman with shoulder-length auburn hair and pale green eyes, lying on the small bed. She was conscious, but barely so, her body trembling despite the warm September air. Her clothes were torn, and scratches marked her arms. but her injuries appeared far less severe than those of her companions. The woman, who later identified herself as Lila Morgenstern, spoke in fragmented whispers as Cole administered first aid and waited for the emergency medical team. She reported that the group had been camping for 3 days without incident. They were college friends from Seattle taking one last trip together before their schedules became too demanding for such adventures. The previous evening had been clear and peaceful, with the group enjoying a campfire and playing card games inside the RV before settling down for sleep around 11 o'clock. Lila recounted that she had been awakened sometime after midnight by what sounded like heavy footsteps circling their campsite. Initially, she had assumed it was a large animal, perhaps a bear investigating their food storage. However, the footsteps had a rhythm that seemed too deliberate, too measured to belong to a four-legged creature. The sound reminded her of someone pacing, as if whatever was outside was studying their setup with careful consideration. The first indication of real danger had come when deep, guttural growls began to shake the entire RV. Lila described the sounds as unlike anything she had ever heard, not quite like a bear, not quite human, but carrying an intelligence that made her skin crawl. The growls seemed to come from directly outside her small bedroom window, and when she had gathered the courage to peek through the blinds, she had seen something that defied her understanding. Standing approximately 10 feet from the RV, partially obscured by the shadows between two massive fir trees, was a figure that towered at least 8 feet tall. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, and its entire frame suggested a muscular mass that dwarfed any human. What struck Lila most was not the creature's size, but the way it stood, completely motionless, as if it were studying the RV with the patience of a predator that knew its prey could not escape. The creature's eyes had reflected what little moonlight filtered through the forest canopy, creating an eerie glow that remained fixed on the RV. Lila reported that she had been frozen with terror, unable to wake her friend or even call out. The creature had remained statue still for what felt like hours, though she acknowledged that terror might have distorted her perception of time. What happened next remained fragmented in Lila's memory. She recalled a tremendous impact against the RV that sent her rolling off the bed, followed by the sounds of her friends screaming and what she could only describe as controlled violence. The attack had been swift, but not frenzied. There had been a methodical quality to the sounds that suggested the creature knew exactly what it was doing. Lila had hidden under the bed, pressing herself against the wall and covering her ears, trying to block out the sounds. She remembered the RV rocking back and forth, as if something enormous was moving around inside, rearranging things with deliberate precision. When silence finally returned, she had remained hidden until dawn, too terrified to emerge and discover what had become of her friends. As Cole documented the scene and waited for the investigation team, he noted additional disturbing details around the campsite. Enormous footprints, easily 24 inches long and 8 inches wide, formed a perfect circle around the RV. The prints showed clear heel and toe impressions, undeniably humanoid, but far too large for any known human. The stride length between prints suggested a creature with legs longer than any person could possess. More unsettling were the small arrangements Cole discovered scattered around the clearing. Pine cones had been stacked into small pyramids at regular intervals, each stack containing exactly 7 cones, arranged in the same pattern. Smooth river rocks, which had no business being in this forest location, formed straight lines pointing toward the RV from multiple directions. A handful of camping utensils had been driven into the soft earth like miniature fence posts, creating a border around the fire pit. These arrangements suggested an intelligence that went beyond simple animal behavior. Whatever had visited this campsite had not only killed with precision, but had also left signs designed to disturb anyone who discovered the scene. The patterns were too deliberate to be coincidental, too complex to be the work of a mindless beast. Cole realized as he surveyed the scene that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than any known wildlife. The evidence pointed to a creature that combined immense physical power with calculated intelligence, something that hunted not just for survival, but with an understanding of psychological manipulation that was deeply unsettling. The investigation that followed would yield few answers, but the signs left in that clearing would haunt everyone involved, suggesting that somewhere in those ancient woods, something massive and intelligent continued to watch, wait, and hunt with terrifying patience. The small town of Marshfield, Vermont, nestled in the Green Mountains approximately 15 miles east of Montpelier, had been hosting its annual Halloween festival for over 30 years. On October 31st, 2023, the celebration took place in the town's Central Park, a modest area surrounded by maple and birch trees that had been cleared by early settlers in the 1800s. Local folklore spoke of strange sightings in the surrounding forests, though most residents attributed such stories to the influence of too much apple cider and the naturally spooky atmosphere of autumn in New England. 17-year-old Lila Hartwell sat alone on a weathered wooden bench at the festival's edge, watching fog curl between the empty carnival booths. The evening had grown unusually quiet as families began heading home, leaving only scattered teenagers and a few dedicated volunteers cleaning up the remnants of the celebration. Jack-o'-lanterns flickered with dying candles, casting dancing shadows across the grass, while the scent of caramel apples and wood smoke lingered in the crisp air. Lila had been waiting for her friends to return from the haunted maze when she first noticed something unsettling. A low, guttural rustling emerged from the tree line approximately 50 feet behind her bench, distinct from the normal sounds of wind through autumn leaves. The noise carried a weight that suggested something substantial moving through the underbrush, yet it moved with a careful deliberation that seemed almost thoughtful. She turned toward the sound, her breath forming small clouds in the cool air, and caught a glimpse of something that made her pulse quicken. Partially concealed in the shadows between two large oak trees stood a massive, upright figure. The shape appeared far too tall and broad to be human, its shoulders spanning a width that seemed impossible. What struck Lila most was the creature's complete stillness. It stood like a statue, as if it had been observing her for some time without her knowledge. Heart racing, Lila jumped to her feet, preparing to run toward the festival lights. However, as she moved, she noticed her small leather purse lying neatly on the ground beside the bench. She distinctly remembered having it on her lap moments before, yet she had not heard it fall. The purse sat perfectly upright, as if someone had carefully placed it there, rather than letting it drop naturally. Goosebumps prickled along Lila's arms as she bent to retrieve her belongings. Her denim jacket felt slightly shifted around her shoulders, as if something had brushed against the fabric with enough force to move it, but gentle enough to avoid alarming her initially. The sensation reminded her of someone walking closely behind her in a crowded hallway, that brief contact that could be accidental or deliberate. Panic overtaking curiosity, Lila grabbed her purse and sprinted toward the festival's main area, where her friends were emerging from the haunted maze. She breathlessly explained what she had witnessed, describing the enormous figure and the strange manipulation of her belongings. Her friends, still energized from their maze experience, laughed off her account as typical Halloween paranoia. They insisted that someone in an elaborate costume must have been playing an elaborate prank, perhaps one of the festival volunteers trying to add extra atmosphere to the evening's entertainment. The possibility of a real creature seemed absurd to them, especially given the holiday setting where masks and costumes were everywhere. However, Lila remained convinced that what she had encountered was neither human nor costume. The figure's proportions had been wrong for any person she knew, and the way it had manipulated her belongings suggested an intelligence that was both calculating and unnervingly personal. Something massive had been watching her with enough skill to approach undetected, rearrange her possessions, and brush against her clothing without her immediate awareness. As her friends drove her home that evening, Lila kept checking the side mirrors, half expecting to see that imposing silhouette following them along the dark mountain roads. The encounter had lasted only minutes, but it left her with the unsettling conviction that somewhere in Vermont's forests, something far larger and more intelligent than any known animal was quietly observing human activities with patient, deliberate interest. The festival continued annually, but Lila never attended another Halloween celebration in Marshfield, too haunted by the memory of being studied by something that seemed to understand human behavior far too well. The Khumbu region of northeastern Nepal, situated at the base of Mount Everest, had witnessed countless climbing expeditions since the 1950s. On April 18, 2019, the notorious Khumbu Icefall, located at approximately 17,000 feet elevation, presented its usual maze of crevasses and unstable ice formations. This treacherous section had claimed numerous lives over the decades, earning a reputation as one of the most dangerous passages on the standard Everest route. The area's geological instability resulted from the constant movement of the Khumbu Glacier, which descended from the western Silbobem at a rate of several feet per day, creating an ever-changing landscape of towering ice blocks and hidden crevasses that could shift without warning. Local Sherpa guides had long spoken of ancient spirits inhabiting the highest peaks, creatures that the Western climbing community typically dismissed as altitude-induced hallucinations or cultural mythology. These stories, passed down through generations of mountain people, described beings of immense size and intelligence that controlled the high places, demanding respect and tribute from those who dared to traverse their domain. The Sherpa community maintained strict protocols for mountain travel, including offerings and ceremonies designed to appease these entities, though most foreign climbers ignored such traditions as primitive superstitions. The weather conditions in April 2019 had been particularly harsh, with frequent storms depositing heavy snow loads that increased avalanche risk throughout the region. Temperatures fluctuated wildly between day and night, causing rapid freeze-thaw cycles that made the already unstable icefall even more treacherous. Many expedition teams had been forced to delay their summit attempts due to these dangerous conditions, creating a backlog of climbers waiting for weather windows at base camp. Sherpa guide Kiran Pemba had been leading expeditions through these mountains for 15 years, possessing an intimate knowledge of the icefall's shifting patterns and hidden dangers. His father and grandfather before him had worked as high-altitude porters, accumulating generations of wisdom about safe passage through the world's most dangerous climbing terrain. Kiran had personally witnessed dozens of accidents and rescues, developing an almost supernatural ability to read the mountain's moods and anticipate potential hazards before they became fatal. On this particular morning, he was returning to base camp after scouting a high-altitude ridge for an upcoming client expedition when he discovered a scene that would fundamentally alter his understanding of mountain hazards. The scouting mission had been routine, checking rope conditions and identifying potential camping locations for a group of Japanese climbers scheduled to begin their ascent the following week. The weather had been clear during his ascent, providing excellent visibility across the icefall's complex terrain. However, as Kiran approached the location where the German team had established their high camp, an unsettling silence pervaded the area. The normal sounds of shifting ice and distant wind seemed muffled, creating an atmosphere of unnatural quiet that immediately put him on alert. His years of mountain experience had taught him to trust such instincts, as they often provided the only warning of impending danger in an environment where mistakes were rarely survivable. The two-person expedition tent belonging to German climbers Heinrich Müller and Klaus Fischer lay completely shredded, the durable fabric torn into ribbons that fluttered in the thin mountain air like prayer flags marking a disaster. The tent had been a high-quality mountaineering shelter designed to withstand the extreme conditions of high-altitude camping, yet it appeared to have been systematically destroyed by something possessing tremendous strength. The destruction appeared methodical rather than random, with each tier following precise lines that suggested deliberate force rather than wind damage or equipment failure. Most disturbing were the deep gouges carved directly into the ice beneath where the tent had stood, parallel scratches that penetrated several inches into the frozen surface. These marks were far too large and too precisely spaced to have been created by conventional climbing equipment, yet they showed a pattern that suggested intentional carving rather than accidental damage. The gouges formed geometric arrangements that seemed to serve no practical purpose, but demonstrated careful planning and execution. The camping area around the destroyed tent showed signs of meticulous organization that contradicted the violent destruction of the shelter itself. Cooking equipment had been stacked in neat piles, water bottles arranged in straight lines, and personal items sorted by size and type with mathematical precision. This bizarre juxtaposition of destruction and organization created a scene that challenged rational explanation, suggesting an intelligence that operated according to unknown but clearly deliberate principles. The bodies of both climbers were discovered draped unnaturally over jagged ice spires approximately 30 feet from their campsite, positioned in ways that defied both physics and common sense. Their placement appeared to have been accomplished with careful consideration for visual impact, as if whoever or whatever had moved them wanted to create a specific impression on anyone who discovered the scene. Heinrich hung suspended between two ice formations, his climbing harness somehow threaded through a gap barely wide enough for his body, while his arms were positioned to create the appearance of embracing the ice. Klaus was impaled on a vertical ice spike, but his body was arranged in a sitting position that suggested peaceful contemplation rather than violent death. Both climbers showed wounds consistent with massive claw marks, yet the injuries were too precise and too strategically placed to result from frenzied animal attack behavior. The cuts appeared designed to incapacitate rather than simply kill, suggesting that their deaths had been secondary to some other purpose. Their climbing gear remained largely intact and properly secured, indicating that they had not fallen or been caught in an avalanche, but had been deliberately positioned after death. The scene's most unsettling aspect was the complete absence of defensive wounds or signs of struggle around the campsite. The snow showed no evidence of combat or attempts to flee, suggesting that whatever had attacked the climbers had done so with such speed and overwhelming force that resistance had been impossible. Yet the careful arrangement of both bodies and equipment indicated that significant time and effort had been invested in organizing the scene after the deaths occurred. What truly unsettled Kieran were the enormous footprints leading away from the destruction, tracks that challenged everything he understood about high-altitude wildlife and human capabilities. The prints measured easily 26 inches in length and showed clear heel, arch, and toe impressions that were undeniably humanoid in structure, yet they belonged to no creature that should exist at such elevation. The tracks traced a path straight up a nearly vertical ice wall, following a route that would be impossible for conventional climbers using the most advanced technical equipment available. Each footprint was pressed deep into the ice with such force that they remained clearly visible despite the previous night's snowfall, indicating the tremendous weight of whatever had created them. The stride length between prints suggested legs far longer than human proportions would allow. Yet the foot structure maintained recognizable anatomical features that ruled out known Himalayan wildlife species. Most remarkably, the tracks showed no accompanying marks from climbing equipment, ice axes, or crampons that would be essential for any human to traverse such terrain. The trail vanished completely at a section of ice wall that rose nearly vertically for over 100 feet, ending at a cornice that overhung empty space above a crevasse field. No technical climbing route existed in that direction, and the ice conditions would be impossible to navigate safely, even for the most experienced mountaineers using proper equipment. Yet the tracks led directly to that impossible ascent and simply disappeared, as if whatever had made them possessed the ability to traverse vertical ice surfaces without mechanical assistance. The climbers' gear had been gathered into small, precise piles arranged around the campsite with mathematical precision. Carabiners, ice axes, and crampons formed geometric patterns that served no practical purpose, but demonstrated an intelligence capable of organizing human tools according to some unknown system. Most unnervingly, Heinrich's expedition journal lay open to a page that detailed their planned route, information that Kieran had not shared with anyone and that the climbers had kept confidential. Earlier that morning, while approaching the ridge, Kieran had glimpsed a massive, upright figure moving silently along the skyline, approximately 200 feet above his position. The shape had been too large and moved too fluidly to be another climber, yet it navigated the treacherous terrain with an ease that suggested intimate familiarity with high-altitude conditions. The figure had paused several times, appearing to observe Kieran's approach with the patience of a predator assessing potential threats. When Kieran radioed the incident to base camp authorities, they initially suggested an avalanche or crevasse accident, both common causes of climbing fatalities in the icefall. However, the evidence contradicted such explanations. The ice formations showed no signs of recent avalanche activity, and the specific positioning of the bodies indicated controlled placement rather than natural disaster. Local Sherpa guides who arrived to assist with body recovery whispered among themselves about patient predators that inhabited the highest peaks, creatures that observed climbing expeditions for days before striking. They spoke of ancient legends, describing beings that understood human behavior well enough to manipulate climbing routes and equipment, using their knowledge to orchestrate accidents that appeared natural to outside investigators. Kieran fled the icefall that afternoon, abandoning his planned route and returning to lower elevations despite the financial implications for his guiding business. The guttural echoes he had heard reverberating through the ice formations, combined with the deliberate arrangements left at the campsite, convinced him that the deaths had been orchestrated with malicious intelligence that combined immense physical capability with calculated hunting strategies. The remote valley of Glen Nevis in the Scottish Highlands, located just a few miles south of Fort William, had served as a popular backpacking destination for decades. On August 12, 2017, the area's rugged terrain of heather-covered hills and ancient pine forests attracted hikers seeking solitude away from Scotland's more crowded tourist routes. Local Highland folklore spoke of creatures dwelling in the deepest glens, stories that most visitors dismissed as remnants of Celtic mythology, designed to add atmosphere to an already mystical landscape. University students Isla McReynolds and Callum Henderson had planned a 3-day hiking expedition through the valley's unmarked trails, carrying lightweight camping gear and enough supplies for self-sufficient wilderness travel. Both were experienced hikers, familiar with highland weather patterns and basic survival techniques, making their choice of this isolated location seem reasonable rather than reckless. They established their campsite in a sheltered hollow surrounded by gnarled Scots pine trees, approximately 2 miles from the nearest marked trail. The evening of their first night passed without incident, with both hikers enjoying clear skies and the peculiar highland phenomenon of extended twilight that stretched well past 10 o'clock. Isla retired to her sleeping bag around 11, while Callum remained outside briefly to secure their food storage against potential wildlife encounters. When Callum awoke the following morning, Isla had vanished completely. Her tent remained perfectly intact, but her sleeping bag was folded with military precision, the corners aligned, and the zipper pulled to an exact midpoint. Her hiking boots sat beside the tent entrance, positioned parallel to each other, with the laces tucked neatly inside. The arrangement suggested deliberate human intervention rather than hasty departure or struggle. Enormous footprints, measuring approximately 28 inches in length, led away from Isla's tent toward the mist-shrouded hills beyond their campsite. The prints showed clear heel and toe impressions that were undeniably humanoid, but far too large for any known person. The stride length between tracks indicated a creature with legs significantly longer than human proportions would allow. Most disturbing were the environmental modifications Callum discovered around their campsite. Tree branches had been bent and twisted into unnatural shapes, forming crude arrow-like configurations that pointed consistently toward the deeper sections of the valley. The modifications required considerable strength to accomplish, yet they had been executed with enough precision to create recognizable directional indicators. As Callum followed the trail, he began to notice acoustic anomalies that made his skin crawl. Guttural growls echoed through the valley, but they seemed to mimic the rhythm of his own breathing with unsettling accuracy. When he paused to listen, the sounds stopped. When he resumed walking, they returned, maintaining a pattern that felt deliberately taunting rather than coincidentally synchronized. After several hours of searching, Callum discovered Isla's wool hiking hat, placed prominently atop a large boulder approximately 1 mile from their campsite. The hat was positioned to face directly toward the ridgeline, creating a marker that was visible only from a specific angle along the trail. The placement was too deliberate to be accidental and too visible to be coincidental. Local authorities who responded to Callum's emergency report suggested that Isla had become disoriented during the night and wandered off, possibly falling into one of the area's numerous hidden ravines. However, the evidence contradicted such explanations. The precise folding of her sleeping bag, the parallel arrangement of her boots, and the directional environmental markers suggested careful planning rather than confused wandering. Search teams combed the valley for 3 days, but found no additional trace of Isla beyond the single hat placement. The enormous footprints led to areas too treacherous for conventional search methods, and the trail eventually disappeared entirely among the rocky outcroppings of the higher elevations. Callum left the highlands convinced that Isla had not simply wandered away, but had been taken by something that understood human psychology well enough to manipulate both physical evidence and emotional responses. The creature had orchestrated her disappearance like an elaborate puzzle, leaving signs that were simultaneously visible and psychologically manipulative. The official search was eventually called off due to weather conditions and resource limitations, but Callum never accepted the conclusion that Isla had died in an accidental fall. He remained haunted by the conviction that somewhere in those ancient hills, something patient and intelligent had studied their campsite before executing a calculated abduction. The vast Siberian taiga surrounding the remote settlement of Tura located approximately 300 kilometers north of the Trans-Siberian Railway in the Krasnoyarsk region, represented one of Earth's last truly untouched wilderness areas. On February 10, 2015, temperatures in this region regularly dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, creating a hostile environment that had remained largely unchanged since the last ice age. Indigenous Evenk people had inhabited these forests for centuries, maintaining oral traditions about powerful spirits that commanded respect and distance from human settlements. Forest ranger Viktor Petrov discovered hunter Alexei Volkonsky stumbling through the snow-laden pines during a routine patrol, approximately 15 kilometers from the nearest logging road. Alexei appeared to have been wandering for hours, his heavy winter clothing torn and blood-stained, his feet bare despite the subarctic conditions. Deep, jagged cuts scarred his arms and torso, the wounds partially frozen but still seeping blood that created a crimson trail in the pristine snow. Alexei muttered incoherently about guttural growls that had shaken the entire forest and a massive, shadowy figure that had attacked him without warning. His account, delivered through chattering teeth and interrupted by periods of blank staring, described an encounter that defied conventional understanding of Siberian wildlife behavior. He claimed the attack had occurred near his temporary hunting shelter, a canvas lean-to he had constructed for a 3-day solo expedition targeting Arctic foxes. Victor immediately noticed the enormous human-shaped footprints that surrounded the area where he had found Alexei. The tracks measured over 24 inches in length and showed clear toe and heel impressions pressed deep into the frozen ground. The stride pattern suggested a creature with legs far longer than any human could possess, yet the prints maintained the distinctive arch and digit arrangement of a bipedal humanoid. Following the trail backward, Victor discovered the remains of Alexei's campsite in a small clearing, dominated by ancient larch trees. The canvas shelter had been completely destroyed, torn into strips that hung from surrounding branches like prayer flags. Most unnervingly, Alexei's hunting rifle lay abandoned in the snow, unfired and apparently discarded during the encounter. Despite the obvious violence of the attack, Alexei's backpack and hunting equipment had been gathered and arranged in a neat pile at the center of the clearing. His compass, knife, emergency flares, and food supplies were stacked with geometric precision that suggested deliberate organization rather than random scattering. The arrangement reminded Victor of military inspection displays, with each item positioned according to some unknown but clearly intentional system. The missing boots particularly troubled Victor. Alexei's heavy winter boots were nowhere to be found at the campsite or along his wandering trail, yet he had somehow survived hours of barefoot travel through snow without suffering severe frostbite. The absence of the boot, combined with the precise arrangement of his other gear, suggested that his attacker had specifically selected certain items for removal while organizing the remainder. When medical personnel arrived to treat Alexei's injuries, they noted the unusual pattern of his wounds. The cuts appeared to have been made by claws of extraordinary size, yet they showed a restraint that was inconsistent with frenzied animal attack behavior. The wounds were deep enough to be serious, but precise enough to avoid major arteries or organs, as if the attacker had deliberately avoided inflicting fatal damage. Local authorities initially dismissed Alexei's account as a hypothermia-induced hallucination, a common occurrence among hunters who became lost in the extreme cold. They theorized that he had been attacked by a brown bear awakened early from hibernation, though such encounters were virtually unknown during February's harsh conditions. However, Victor recognized elements in the evidence that contradicted bear attack patterns. The systematic arrangement of equipment, the specific removal of boot, and the enormous humanoid footprints suggested an intelligence that operated according to calculated decision-making rather than instinctive aggression. Alexei eventually recovered from his physical injuries, but remained psychologically traumatized by the encounter. He insisted that he had been attacked by something that combined immense strength with deliberate planning, a creature that had observed him long enough to understand his camping routine before executing a precise attack that left him alive but terrified. The official incident report attributed the attack to a wildlife encounter with hypothermic complications, but Victor filed a separate account detailing the anomalous evidence that suggested a far more disturbing explanation for what had occurred in those frozen woods. The scenic railway line that wound through the fog-drenched mountains of eastern Tennessee had operated tourist excursions since the 1960s, offering visitors panoramic views of the ancient Appalachian landscape. In May 2021, the restored steam locomotive carried passengers along a route that had originally been constructed for logging operations in the early 1900s. The track curved through dense forests of oak, maple, and pine trees that had witnessed centuries of human activity, yet still contained remote sections where modern civilization seemed to vanish entirely. The afternoon excursion on May 15th included approximately 40 passengers enjoying the late spring scenery as a steady downpour created dramatic mist effects throughout the mountain valleys. The train had been operating smoothly for nearly 2 hours when it rounded a sharp curve at mile marker 17, approximately 10 miles east of the main station facility. Without warning, the entire train shuddered violently as if struck by something massive and immovable. Passengers were thrown from their seats as the cars swayed dramatically, metal groaning under immense pressure that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. The conductor, James Morrison, immediately engaged the emergency brakes. Fearing a derailment or collision with fallen debris, rain hammered against the windows with unusual intensity, reducing visibility to mere yards in any direction. Passengers screamed as the train rocked again, this time accompanied by a sound that several described as metallic squealing, combined with something resembling an extremely deep, guttural vocalization that seemed to emanate from the surrounding forest. Morrison brought the train to a complete stop and immediately began checking for visible damage or track obstruction. The rails appeared clear of fallen trees, rock slides, or other typical hazards that could explain the violent impact. However, the surrounding mud bore enormous human-shaped footprints that traced a path parallel to the railway line before veering abruptly into the dense forest canopy. The footprints measured approximately 30 inches in length and showed clear heel, arch, and toe impressions pressed deep into the saturated earth. The stride length between tracks indicated a creature with legs significantly longer than human proportions would allow. Yet the prints maintained the unmistakable characteristics of bipedal locomotion rather than quadrupedal animal movement. Several pine trees adjacent to the track showed fresh damage that defied easy explanation. Trunk sections 12 to 15 feet above ground level had been splintered and broken, creating wounds that appeared to have been caused by tremendous impact force applied from below. The damage patterns suggested that something had struck the trees with enough power to shatter wood at height that would be impossible for ground-based animals to reach. Passenger Margaret Whitfield, seated in the observation car nearest the forest side of the train, reported seeing a towering, broad-shouldered silhouette illuminated briefly by lightning during the most violent period of rocking. She described a figure that stood motionless among the trees, apparently unaffected by the driving rain, before vanishing so completely that she questioned whether she had actually seen anything at all. The train's metal exterior showed new dents and scratches along the lower sections of several cars, damage that appeared fresh and consistent with contact from something extremely large and powerful. The marks were too high to have been caused by typical track debris, yet too low to result from overhead branches or electrical equipment. Morrison radioed ahead to the main station, reporting mechanical difficulties and requesting inspection personnel to meet the train upon its return. He chose not to mention the footprints or tree damage over the radio, preferring to discuss such anomalous findings in person with supervisory staff. The remainder of the journey proceeded without incident, though several passengers remarked on the unusual silence that seemed to blanket the forest following the mysterious impact. Birds that had been singing throughout the earlier portions of the trip remained silent, and even the usual sounds of small forest animals had ceased entirely. Railway officials who investigated the incident attributed the problems to shifting soil conditions caused by the heavy rainfall, suggesting that track settlement had created temporary instability that explained the violent motion passengers had experienced. They dismissed reports of the enormous footprints as misidentified bear track, distorted by rain and mud conditions. However, Morrison remained convinced that something far more unusual had tested the train's structural integrity that afternoon. The combination of precise impact, environmental damage, and the complete disappearance of whatever had caused the disturbance suggested an intelligence capable of approaching, investigating, and departing without leaving conventional evidence of its presence. Passengers left the experience with conflicting emotions, some accepting the official explanation of weather-related track problems, while others remained haunted by the conviction that they had encountered something massive and deliberately investigative during their journey through those ancient, mist-shrouded mountains.